Judge insults Pam Bondi in open court. Minutes later, she has him in handcuffs. Pam Bondi was no stranger to pressure. She had spent years in the legal trenches, tackling some of the toughest cases in the country. But today felt different. As she stepped into the courtroom of Judge Howard Gates, a man infamous for his sharp tongue and unpredictable rulings, she knew this wouldn't be an ordinary hearing. The case at hand was a high-stakes government ethics violation, with the potential to shake up more than a few careers. The defendant, a wealthy developer with deep political ties, stood accused of funneling state funds into his private projects. The evidence was stacked high, and Bondi had come prepared. What she hadn't prepared for was the hostility radiating from the bench. Before she could even speak, Judge Gates barely glanced up as she approached the plaintiff's table. Instead, he flipped through a file at an agonizingly slow pace, letting the courtroom sit in silence, a silence designed to make a statement. Finally, without looking at her, he spoke. "Miss Bondi, I assume you've prepared something of substance today? Or should we just skip ahead to the part where you waste my time?" A few chuckles rippled through the back of the courtroom, mostly from the defendant's legal team. Bondi ignored them. She had faced worse. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself. This case involves the misuse of taxpayer dollars, and my job is to ensure the facts are presented accurately." Judge Gates leaned back in his chair, feigning boredom. "Taxpayer dollars, right? Because that's never been the foundation of a frivolous case before." Bondi's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous." For a moment, their eyes met, his cold and calculating, hers unwavering. But before she could continue, he cut her off again. "Miss Bondi, spare me the lectures, just get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned." A murmur spread through the gallery. Judges could be tough, but this felt different. This was personal. Bondi took a slow breath, recalibrating. She knew what he was doing, trying to throw her off balance, control the tempo, put her on the defensive. But she wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. She picked up a folder from the table, flipping it open. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly demonstrate—" Gates interrupted again. "Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork, or is this just your way of compensating?" The shift in the room was instant. The defense attorney smirked. A few reporters exchanged glances, but Bondi didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that men like Judge Gates thrived on intimidation. The only way to beat them was to never let them see you rattle. She let the silence linger just long enough to make a statement without saying a word. Then, she set the folder down and clasped her hands together. "Your Honor, if you'd prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have." It was subtle, not aggressive, not disrespectful, but pointed. A clear warning. She wasn't going to roll over. Gates's lips curled slightly. Amusement? Annoyance? It was hard to tell. "Oh, I don't have concerns, Miss Bondi. I just know a weak case when I see one." This time the reaction wasn't just murmurs. A few gasps. Someone whispered under their breath. This wasn't how a judge was supposed to conduct a hearing. Bondi could feel the weight of the room shifting. Eyes darted between her and the judge like a tennis match. But she wasn't going to engage in a shouting match, that's what he wanted. Instead, she adjusted her blazer, straightened a few papers, and looked him dead in the eye. "Then I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking." But as she spoke, she caught something in his expression, something beyond arrogance or condescension, a flicker of something deeper, and that's when she knew. This wasn't just courtroom theatrics. Judge Gates wasn't just being combative. For sport, he had something to hide, and what he didn't know, so did she. Pam Bondi had been in plenty of tense hearings before, but this was different. Judge Gates wasn't just ruling from the bench. He was playing a game, a calculated, deliberate attempt to undermine her in front of the entire courtroom. And he was about to lose. She could feel the weight of his stare as she moved through her arguments. Every word she spoke, he was poised to pounce. She could practically see it. The slight curl of his lips, the slow, deliberate tap of his fingers on the bench. He was daring her to keep going. She wasn't about to stop. "Your Honor," she said, keeping her tone measured. "These documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's company received nearly triple the amount approved in the original budget, and none of it was accounted for in state records." She turned slightly, gesturing toward the projection screen where the financial statements were displayed. "Now, if you look here, Miss Bondi," Gates cut in, his voice laced with that same smug edge. "I hate to interrupt your presentation. Really, I do, but I think we've seen enough numbers for one day." Bondi glanced at him, then back at the screen. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. "Your Honor, with all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of the case." "Right," he scoffed. "And yet, I fail to see anything that justifies wasting the court's time like this." There, it was again. Wasting time. He was trying to bury the case before it even got off the ground, a soft rustle behind her, the sound of the prosecution team shifting, exchanging looks. They felt it too. Something wasn't right. Bondi tightened, her grip on her pen, flipping to the next page in her file. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to..." Denied. Silence. She looked up. "I haven't even stated the motion yet. And yet I can already tell you it's going nowhere." Gates leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "Let's be honest, Miss Bondi. This entire case is built on speculation. A little creative accounting and suddenly you're crying corruption." The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy suit, smirked. He hadn't had to say a word. Gates was doing all the work for him. Bondi exhaled slowly. "Your Honor, are you refusing to hear my motion before I've even stated its contents?" A pause, a beat too long. "I'm refusing to indulge this circus act any longer." The courtroom wasn't just tense now, it was shifting. Eyes darted, heads turned, even the reporters in the back were scribbling faster. Bondi caught the gaze of a juror, a woman in her 50s dressed in a dark blazer. The woman's brows furrowed, lips pressed together. She wasn't the only one noticing. The problem with arrogance? It makes people pay attention. Bondi squared her shoulders. "Very well, Your Honor, then let's proceed with the next piece of evidence." She turned back to the screen, clicking to the next slide. "This document, obtained through a subpoena, shows that..." "Miss Bondi," the tone was different this time. She stopped, looked at him. Judge Gates was no longer leaning back in his chair, no longer wearing that smug expression. His hands were clasped now, his mouth a thin, hard line. Something had changed. "Approach the bench." It wasn't a request. She hesitated, then set her papers down and walked toward him. The courtroom hushed. When she reached the bench, he lowered his voice just enough so only she could hear. "I'd strongly suggest you reconsider the direction you're taking here, Miss Bondi." She tilted her head slightly. "Excuse me?" "I'm saying," he murmured, "that some fights aren't worth having." She let that sit in the air between them. Then slowly, deliberately, she leaned in just an inch closer. "I don't scare easily, Judge Gates." A muscle in his jaw twitched. She turned and walked back to her table, but that moment told her everything she needed to know. Pam Bondi returned to her seat, her mind racing. That wasn't just a power move. That was a warning. A veiled threat, disguised as judicial authority. But why? She had walked into this courtroom expecting pushback, maybe even hostility. But this was something deeper. Judge Gates wasn't just biased, he was protecting something or someone. She adjusted a stack of papers, keeping her expression neutral. The prosecution team beside her shifted, waiting for her reaction. She didn't give one. Not yet. Instead, she lifted her chin and faced the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting my evidence." Gates didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, as if deciding just how far he wanted to push. Then finally, "Proceed. But keep it brief." Bondi didn't acknowledge the jab. She simply reached for the next file. "This Document is a contract signed between the defendant and the city's planning board, outlining the proposed project expenses. You'll notice that the listed cost total is just over $2 million. She paused and waited. With deliberate precision, Bondi placed another sheet on the projector. This, she said, is an internal ledger from the defendant's company. The numbers were damning. Funds transferred nearly double the approved amount. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Before it could settle, she placed a third document down. And here, she continued, is the approval signature. She hesitated, letting the moment stretch. Signed by Judge Howard Gates. The courtroom didn't just shift, it cracked. A ripple of movement, pen scratching, eyes darting. The defense attorney stiffened, his smug expression wiped clean. Judge Gates? He didn't move. For the first time since she'd entered this courtroom, his face was unreadable. Bondi let the silence sit, then delivered the next blow. Your Honor, would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant? A calculated risk. She didn't have the full story, but she had enough to send the foundation beneath him shaking. Gates finally moved, just barely. A slight shift in his chair, his fingers pressed together, knuckles whitening. That document, he said slowly, is inadmissible. Bondi tilted her head. How so? It was obtained improperly. She let that sink in. Your Honor, she said, measured, this document was subpoenaed by my office. His nostrils flared. Then it was mishandled. I'm ruling it inadmissible. A beat of silence. And this time, it wasn't just the gallery shifting. It was everyone. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff, all of them watching. Bondi crossed her arms, her tone calm. You do realize this is a public hearing, correct? A muscle in his jaw jumped. That the media is here? She continued. That every single person in this room just watched you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible without cause. Gates's expression tightened. That's enough, Miss Bondi. She didn't move, didn't blink. Then slowly, she sat down and did something that changed everything. She reached into her case, pulled out a small recorder, set it on the table, and pressed play. A voice filled the courtroom. Low, gruff, unmistakable. Take care of it, I don't care how. The recording crackled, then continued. Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers. Silence. Absolute. Suffocating. Judge Gates didn't move, didn't breathe. Bondi didn't look at him. She didn't need to, because now every single person in that courtroom had heard him, and the real game was about to begin. The recording ended, leaving nothing but thick, suffocating silence in its wake. No murmurs, no whispered speculation, just a collective realization. Judge Howard Gates had just been caught. Bondi didn't move. She kept her eyes on the recorder, daring him to challenge what had just played. But he didn't. He couldn't. Across the room, the defense attorney finally blinked, his composure slipping, the smirk gone, and in its place, something much closer to dread. He glanced at his client, the wealthy developer whose empire had been built on backroom deals and political favors. The man looked pale. Judge Gates cleared his throat. Miss Bondi, he said, his voice forced. I don't know where you obtained that recording. That's not the question you should be asking, Your Honor. His eyes flickered. Excuse me? The real question, she said, unwavering, is who were you talking to? His fingers curled into fists. This is outrageous, he snapped. This entire hearing is descending into chaos because of your grandstanding. Chaos? Bondi repeated, her tone light, almost amused. I'd say this is clarity. The tension in the room hitched up another notch. She let it breathe. Let him sweat. Then, without breaking stride, she reached for another document, slid it across the table. Your Honor, this is a transcript of a wiretap, legally obtained during our investigation. She tapped the top of the page. It corroborates everything you just heard on that recording. Gates's eyes flicked to the page, but he didn't touch it. His chest rose and fell, his breathing suddenly louder. Bondi turned slightly, looked at the bailiff. "Officer Reynolds," she said smoothly, "would you kindly read the highlighted section aloud?" A hesitation. Then the bailiff picked up the transcript. His voice was steady, but the weight of the words made the room feel smaller. "We'll take care of her. Bondi doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom." A sharp inhale from the gallery. Bondi folded her hands together. "I'd like to submit this as evidence, Your Honor." Judge Gates's eyes flickered past her, toward the exit. A tiny movement, barely noticeable, but enough. Enough for the room to realize that for the first time, Judge Howard Gates was thinking about something other than his own arrogance. He was thinking about escape, but it was far too late for that. "Motion denied," he barked. Bondi raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "This hearing is over," Gates snapped, his voice just a fraction too loud. "I will not allow—" "Judge Gates," Bondi interrupted smoothly. "I wasn't asking for your permission." And then she did it, the move she had been waiting for. She turned toward the back of the courtroom, gave the smallest, subtlest nod. A door opened. Footsteps echoed against the polished floor. Then, Judge Howard Gates, a firm, authoritative voice announced, "You are under arrest." Gasps erupted. Reporters fumbled for their phones. Cameras clicked. The jury gaped. Even the defendant, the powerful developer who had expected this trial to be nothing more than a formality, looked genuinely stunned. Gates didn't turn, didn't speak. He just sat there staring at a single point on his bench, as if he didn't move it would all disappear. But reality had already caught up with him. Two uniformed officers flanked the judge. One reached into his pocket. The other pulled out a set of cuffs. "This is absurd," Gates muttered, though the fight had already drained from his voice. The officer didn't blink. "You have the right to remain silent." And for the first time in his career, Judge Howard Gates was. The sound of metal clicking shut was deafening. The cuffs locked around his wrists, sealing his fate in front of the very people he had spent years ruling over. The once commanding figure behind the bench now sat frozen, his expression a mask of disbelief. The courtroom crackled with stunned murmurs, disbelief hanging in the air like electricity. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even the jury, bound by duty to remain impartial, couldn't hide their shock. Pam Bondi remained seated, her face unreadable. This wasn't about gloating, this wasn't about revenge, this was about justice. Gates finally found his voice. "You can't do this." The words came out low, almost a whisper, as if even he didn't believe them. The officer holding his arm didn't flinch. "Sir, you are being taken into custody for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You'll have your chance to speak with an attorney." Gates yanked against the cuffs, his face flushing. "This is a disgrace. I am the law in this courtroom." Bondi finally stood, straightened her blazer. "Not anymore." His head snapped toward her, and for the first time, the arrogance was gone. Replaced by something else, something much closer to fear. The officers pulled him to his feet. He resisted. "This is political," he sputtered. "This is—" Bondi shook her head. "This is accountability." Silence, a lifetime of unchecked power, gone in an instant. Gates' face twisted. His jaw clenched as he turned to the gallery. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for an ally. Someone who would stand up and declare this a mistake. But no one moved, because it wasn't a mistake. A few feet away, the defense attorney had gone ghost white. The developer, the man who had thought his influence could shield him, wasn't faring much better. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, his breathing shallow. Bondi let her gaze linger on him for just a second before turning back to Gates. "Your Honor," she said, calm, measured, "if you have anything to say, I'd suggest you save." It for your arraignment. Gates' mouth opened, then shut. Because there was nothing left to say. The officers began escorting him toward the side exit. And then, wait! The developer's chair scraped against the floor as he shot up, eyes darting between Gates and Bondi. This is getting out of hand, he said, voice thin with panic. We can work something out. Bondi turned, arched an eyebrow. Work something out? The man swallowed. He was unraveling. I mean, there's no need for this kind of public spectacle. Let's be reasonable. Bondi studied him for a moment, then took a slow, deliberate step forward. You seem nervous, Mr. Lawson. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. She tilted her head. Why would that be? He shook his head, forcing a laugh. Nervous? No, this is just... He gestured vaguely. This is insane. You don't seriously believe Gates is guilty, do you? Bondi let the question hang. Then, finally, she answered. Do you? Silence. The officers moved again, leading Gates through the door. The moment it shut behind him, the weight of it all settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was the unraveling of a system that had been protected for far too long, and Pam Bondi wasn't done yet. She glanced at the jury, at the empty judge's seat, then at the defense table. I believe we still have a trial to finish, but after what had just happened, everyone in that room knew. This was only the beginning. The air felt different now, lighter, as if years of corruption had been lifted in an instant. Judge Gates was gone, hauled out in cuffs, and yet the shock of it lingered, hanging in the air like the final note of a symphony. Bondi took her seat again, adjusting the papers in front of her. The trial wasn't over, not yet, but the biggest obstacle had just been removed. She turned her attention to the defense table. Charles Lawson sat eerily still. The usual smugness was gone, replaced by something colder, more calculating. Bondi could see the wheels turning in his head, assessing the damage, how much of his safety net had just been ripped away. Without Gates on the bench, his legal team would have to argue this case on its own merits. And they had none. Bondi leaned forward slightly. Mr. Lawson, would you like to continue with today's proceedings? A pause, then smoothly. Or, would you prefer to discuss a plea? His jaw clenched. This is a witch hunt. Bondi gave a small smile. No, Mr. Lawson. She held his gaze. This is justice. He scoffed, shaking his head. You think one corrupt judge changes anything? You think this means you win? Bondi didn't respond right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch. Let the weight of the moment sink in. I think it means the system still works, she said finally. That no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the truth will always catch up to them. Lawson exhaled sharply, but he had nothing left to say. The judge's seat remained empty, but it didn't matter. This case was no longer in his hands. Across the table, the prosecution team exchanged glances. One of Bondi's colleagues leaned in. This might be a good time to push for a deal. Bondi considered it. She could feel the shift in the room, the way the jury was watching, waiting. They had just witnessed something they would never forget, but she wasn't about to let this end with a whisper. She stood. Your Honor, then paused, corrected herself. To the presiding judge who will take over this case. She let the words settle before continuing. I'd like to submit a formal request to proceed with additional evidence. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Given today's events, it's clear we need a full investigation into how far this corruption reaches. She turned slightly, eyes locking onto Lawson. Judge Gates was only part of the problem, she said. If my team uncovered this, it means there's more. There's more names, more people who thought they were untouchable. She stepped forward, voice steady. So I'll ask you again, Mr. Lawson. Do you want to talk? Lawson sat rigid, fingers tapping against the table. He was weighing his options. Silence stretched, then finally, he exhaled. If I do, he said slowly, I want protection, Bondi nodded. Then you'd better start talking. The courtroom was no longer the same place it had been an hour ago. The balance of power had shifted. The walls protecting the powerful had started to crack, and Pam Bondi had just sent a message. To everyone watching, no one is above the law. As the bailiff called for order, the trial prepared to move forward. Reporters in the back rushed to get their stories out. This wasn't just another case. This was history, and it was only the beginning.